family of 3 goes on a peaceful trip to the towering Redwoods, but something goes horribly wrong. By evening, no word from them. A simple hike turns into a nightmare. The calls to Serena's phone go unanswered, and the silence stretches into panic. Odelia, Serena's mother, contacts the authorities, and a search begins. Days of searching pass, but there is still no sign of the family. A photograph from their last hike offers a glimmer of hope, but the family remains missing. A breakthrough. The car was found at the trailhead, untouched, as if they had vanished into thin air. But then, for years later, a discovery beneath a tree would change everything. In late August 2013, the Redwood National Park in Northern California, known for its towering ancient trees and peaceful atmosphere, became the setting for a trip that would never be forgotten. Serena Quaid, 32, her husband Kalen Van Craftoft, 33, and their infant daughter, Isla, embarked on what was supposed to be a simple, serene hike through the park. Serena and Kalen were seasoned travelers, familiar with the wilderness, and the trip was intended to introduce their 6-month-old daughter to the wonders of nature. Kalen, an environmental consultant, had planned the trip meticulously. They were to stay on easy, well-marked trails, routes that would be accessible for Isla, who would be carried in a baby carrier on Kalen's chest. The plan was simple, yet it became a journey that no one could have ever imagined. As they made their way deeper into the park, the air became thick with the scent of pine and moss. Serena, ever the cautious one, kept a close eye on Isla, her tiny hands gripping her shirt as she rested in the carrier. Kalen, with his usual confidence, was leading the way. The trail, which had been well-trodden and clear, seemed to stretch endlessly before them. The towering trees around them seemed to stretch on forever, creating a vast and almost overwhelming sense of isolation. The couple shared laughter and light conversation, admiring the ancient beauty around them. However, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, a sense of unease slowly crept over Serena. The trail they had been following was no longer familiar. Serena stopped to check their map and GPS. She noticed that the signal was weak, and the route they had been following didn't quite match the one marked on their map. Kalen reassured her, suggesting that they might have missed a turn, but Serena couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was wrong. "Let's just double-check," she said, voice filled with concern. They retraced their steps, but the trees around them, which once seemed welcoming, now felt suffocating. The trail had become almost unrecognizable. What had seemed like an enjoyable adventure now felt more like a maze, and as the sky darkened further, their pace quickened. Kalen, still calm, checked his phone for a signal. Nothing. The last trace of daylight was quickly fading. They pressed on, Kalen's experience and knowledge of the outdoors giving them hope. But as the hours passed and night began to fall, the familiar sense of safety they had once felt turned into a heavy, suffocating fear. The woods felt alive, too alive, almost as though they were being watched. The darkness had fallen completely, and with it, the sense of urgency grew. Serena clutched Isla tightly in the baby carrier, her heart pounding. "Kalen, we need to find a way out," she whispered, her voice trembling. Kalen, who had always been the one to reassure her, now seemed lost for words. His usual composure faltered as he scanned the woods around them. The trees now seemed to close in, the shadows stretching as the night deepened. Kalen cursed under his breath, realizing that their situation had become far worse than he had anticipated. They were lost, truly lost, with no way to call for help. With no options left, they tried to keep moving. But after hours of wandering, Serena's anxiety began to turn into a palpable dread. The forest seemed to be shifting around them, as if it was alive, guiding them further into its depths. The weight of the baby carrier on Kalen's chest now seemed heavier, as though the weight of their situation was dragging them down. They had no food, no water, and no way of knowing which direction they were headed. "We'll be fine," Kalen said, his voice strained as he tried to convince Serena. "We just need to stay calm and keep walking." but even his calm demeanor couldn't mask the growing sense of hopelessness. The hours dragged on, and Serena began to wonder how much longer they could keep walking. It had been so long since they had seen a familiar landmark or trail marker. The forest, which had once seemed so inviting, now felt like a labyrinth that had swallowed them whole. As they continued their trek, something odd happened. A chill settled over them, even as the air remained warm. A faint rustling in the trees seemed to follow them, growing louder with each step they took. Kalen looked around, his senses alert. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low and tense. Serena nodded, her breath catching in her throat. She had heard it too, but there was nothing. The forest was eerily quiet once more. Still, they pressed on. As the hours passed, the oppressive silence of the forest became deafening. Kalen and Serena, exhausted but determined, kept walking, each step taking them further into the vast wilderness. The thick foliage had swallowed the trail entirely, and there was no sign of civilization. It was as if the forest itself was closing in around them, trapping them in a web of ancient trees and shadows. Kalen stopped to catch his breath. His usual calm and collected demeanor was slipping, his brow furrowed in concern. He had spent his life navigating the wilderness, but this was different. The forest felt alive, watching them, and the path they had been following seemed to be disappearing with every step. "I don't know how much further we can go, Serena," Kalen admitted, his voice tight. "We've been walking for hours, and there's no sign of the trail. It's like we've gone in circles." Serena nodded, the weight of Isla in the carrier becoming almost unbearable. The baby's soft whimper broke the eerie silence, a reminder of their responsibility and the growing desperation they felt. But Serena didn't speak. She simply clutched the baby tighter, her heart pounding in her chest. The sun had completely set by the time they realized they were truly lost. Their only source of light was the faint glow of their phone's flashlight, and even that flickered with every passing minute. Serena felt a coldness creeping into her bones, not from the temperature, but from the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled over them. Kalen's frustration was palpable now. He had always been the one to guide them, the one to keep their hike safe. But here, in the vastness of the Redwoods, he felt like a child lost in a labyrinth. The path was gone. His confidence had faded, replaced by a gnawing fear that he couldn't shake. Serena noticed it in his eyes. The fear was no longer just hers. They were both trapped in the same nightmare. "We need to find shelter," Serena said, her voice shaky. "It's getting colder. We'll freeze out here." Kalen didn't reply immediately. He was scanning the dark expanse of trees, trying to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't a typical hike. Something was wrong. Suddenly, they heard a sound, a rustling in the trees to their left. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but it was there. Kalen's eyes darted toward the noise. He grabbed Serena's arm, pulling her close. "Did you hear that?" Kalen whispered, his voice tight with suspicion. "I hear it," Serena responded, her heart racing. She could feel Isla stirring in her carrier, the baby's soft breath against her chest, a comforting reminder of what they were fighting for. The sound came again, this time louder, closer. The hairs on the back of Serena's neck stood up. She felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't the wind. This was something else. Without thinking, they started moving again, pushing through the dense underbrush, trying to follow the faintest signs of a trail. But the forest was relentless. Each step was harder than the last. Kalen's frustration turned to panic as they pressed forward, the trail seeming to stretch on endlessly. The noise followed them, sometimes faint, sometimes close. Kalen stopped, his breathing heavy. He turned to Serena, the desperation clear in his eyes. "I don't know what's happening," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here." But it was too late. The forest had swallowed them whole. And just as the sense of panic was about to take hold, Kalen froze. He had caught sight of something through the trees, a flicker of movement, the outline of a figure ahead. "Kaylin," Serena asked, her voice trembling as she followed his gaze. "What is it?" The figure didn't move, stood there, as if waiting, watching them. Kaylin's pulse raced. He should have felt relief at the sight of another person, but something about the stillness of the figure unnerved him. They had been walking in circles for hours. Could it be another hiker, or something else? "Stay close," Kaylin ordered quietly, his protective instinct kicking in. "Let's go check it out. Stay behind me." They moved slowly, cautiously, making their way toward the figure. As they drew closer, the figure remained unmoving, a silhouette against the dark forest. When they were just a few feet away, Kaylin called out, "Hey, are you lost too?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it shifted slightly as though hearing him but still did not speak. The silence stretched out between them, growing heavier with every passing second. Without warning, the figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Kaylin and Serena stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do next. The figure had vanished, leaving only the eerie sounds of the forest behind. Kaylin took a deep breath and turned to Serena. "We need to get out of here now." But the fear that had been building in his chest was now shared by Serena. They were no longer just lost, they were being watched. As the days passed, Odelia Hastings' anxiety deepened into a gnawing fear. The sun had set, and still, there was no word from her daughter. The silence felt suffocating. In her mind, she replayed every phone call, every message, everything she could recall about the last conversation they'd had before Serena and Kaylin left. Had she said anything that could have hinted at trouble? Had something gone wrong on the hike? Unable to contain her worry any longer, Odelia made the call to local authorities. Her daughter and son-in-law were overdue, and she hadn't heard a word from them since that morning. It didn't take long for the sheriff's department to take notice. The couple was well known for their adventurous spirit, especially Kaylin, a seasoned hiker who knew how to survive in the wilderness. This wasn't like them, and the added complication of a 6-month-old baby, Isla, meant the clock was ticking, fast. Odelia spent hours pacing back and forth in her living room, the weight of the silence pressing in on her. She had known the forest was unpredictable, but she never thought it could swallow a family whole, leaving nothing behind. With every minute that passed, her heart sank a little more. Authorities soon mobilized a search and rescue operation, but with no concrete leads, the search was a shot in the dark. Kaylin and Serena's vehicle had been found locked at the trailhead, undisturbed, which meant they had indeed begun their hike. But where had they gone? The forest was vast, a sprawling 139,000-acre maze of towering redwoods, steep ravines, and thick underbrush. There was no guarantee they had followed the correct trail, and the dense canopy made aerial searches almost useless. Search teams set out in every direction, but as the days turned into weeks, the situation only became more dire. The forest had claimed them, and no amount of manpower seemed to make a difference. Kaylin had planned everything carefully, according to his family and friends. The route was supposed to be easy, leisurely, a day hike with simple trails suitable for a baby. Yet here they were, in the middle of a forest that seemed to devour everything in its path. Investigators had no idea where to begin, and with the lack of new evidence, it became clear. They were facing one of the most challenging cases of their careers. Odelia clung to a thread of hope, a small spark of optimism that they would find something, anything, that would lead to her daughter and her family. The first lead came through unexpected channels, technology. Investigators, desperate to find any clue, requested access to Kaylin and Serena's digital devices. They knew that the couple was active on social media, and Kaylin, in particular, was a keen photographer. A single photograph synced to their cloud storage on the day they went missing became the first concrete clue in the case. The photo showed Kaylin, Serena, and Isla standing on a dirt trail surrounded by the towering redwoods. The warm sunlight filtered through the trees, casting soft shadows over the family. Kaylin's broad smile and Serena's warm embrace of Isla made it seem like just another day in paradise. But to Odelia, seeing the photo was like a punch to the gut. The happiness they had shared in that moment now felt haunting, and it only deepened the mystery of their sudden disappearance. The metadata from the photo helped investigators narrow down the trail to a specific section of the park, and from there, they began tracing the couple's steps. But one key detail stood out. The photo was not a selfie. Kaylin had handed the phone to someone else to take the picture, someone who may have seen them last. The trailhead where the family had parked their vehicle was found undisturbed. No sign of a struggle, no indication that they had been ambushed or attacked. Everything seemed so ordinary, yet the family was missing, lost somewhere in the massive stretch of wilderness. The mystery deepened. Kaylin's family confirmed that he would never take unnecessary risks. They insisted that he wouldn't venture off trail without a clear plan, especially with Serena and Isla in tow. Kaylin had always been meticulous about safety. That's what made his disappearance even more puzzling. Where were they? The forest, with its oppressive silence and vastness, had swallowed them whole. As the search efforts continued, Odelia felt herself slipping into despair. The weeks that passed without new information were unbearable. How could her daughter and son-in-law, experienced travelers with a baby in tow, just vanish without a trace? Was there something she didn't know? Could something terrible have happened in those remote woods? But despite the hopelessness, one thing kept her going: hope. The search was far from over, and she was determined to push forward, no matter the cost. Then, just when it seemed like the case might be lost forever, a small breakthrough arrived. Investigators learned that the last photograph had been taken by another hiker, someone who had encountered Kaylin and Serena on the trail that day. The hiker, an older man visiting from out of town, recalled the brief interaction. He remembered the family clearly: the baby with the pink headband, the bright smiles, and the moment they shared on the trail. But there was one important piece of information that he offered, one that seemed innocuous at first but would later prove to be a pivotal clue. The family continued on the trail after the photograph was taken, heading deeper into the Redwoods. Weeks turned into months, and the search for Kaylin, Serena, and Isla had begun to slow. Investigators combed the forest tirelessly, but despite their efforts, there was still no sign of the missing family. The vastness of the Redwood National and State Parks made every search a daunting task, and as time wore on, the urgency of the search began to wane. Odelia Hastings, however, could not accept the thought of giving up. Every day, she clung to the hope that they were still out there, lost but alive. She refused to believe that her daughter and son-in-law had disappeared without a trace. Something had happened, something that was keeping them from returning. But what? As months passed, the case was pushed into the background. Other, more recent disappearances took precedence. The story of the missing family became another sad chapter in the history of the Redwoods, buried under layers of time and forgotten by the public. Odelia, devastated, continued her search in her own way, often returning to the parks to look for clues, to find the answers that were always just out of reach. It wasn't until 4 years later, in the summer of 2017, that something unexpected brought the case back into the light. A team of graduate students from Oregon had been granted permission to conduct research in a remote area of the park. They were studying the effects of wildfires on the ecosystem, specifically on fungal regrowth. Their research had led them to a section of the park far removed from the typical trails, miles away from where the Van Craft-Tofquade family had vanished. While hiking deep into the park, the group stumbled upon something strange, something that would soon tie back to the family's mysterious disappearance. As they walked along a less traveled section of the forest, a member of the research team, Xander Zeller, noticed an unusual growth at the base of a tree. It was large and unlike anything he had ever encountered in his years of fieldwork. The mass was a strange mix of yellow, white, and black, a chaotic, lumpy structure that seemed out of place in the natural surroundings. But it was the smell that drew Zeller's attention. A sharp, pungent odor that cut through the usual earthy scents of the forest. Zeller called the other members of the team over to examine it. They were all intrigued by the unusual mass, but none of them could explain it. It didn't resemble any fungi they had studied before. Their curiosity piqued. They took photos and documented their findings. As they continued to discuss the possible origins of the growth, one thing was clear. This was not something they had encountered in their research before. After photographing the growth, the team moved on with their hike. But the strange encounter lingered in Zeller's mind. That night, back at their research station, he showed the photos to a resident park botanist who was stationed there for the season. The botanist was equally stunned by the sight of the growth and suggested that it was likely the result of decomposition gases from a buried animal carcass, possibly a bear or an elk. The gases released during decomposition could fuel an unusual fungal bloom. It was a plausible theory and one that intrigued the team. The next day, they returned to the site, equipped with the proper tools to dig and collect samples. As they approached the tree, the growth was still there, undisturbed. But as they dug into the earth, the stench intensified, making the air thick with the smell of decay. They couldn't help but notice how the growth had spread in a way that suggested something had been buried beneath it. Something large. The ground beneath was soft, and Zeller's shovel soon struck something odd. It wasn't a rock or a root. The shovel resisted and then gave way to something that seemed off. Zeller cleared the dirt away to reveal large sheets of black plastic, like a tarp. His heart skipped a beat. This wasn't the decomposition of an animal carcass. This was something else entirely. The team's initial curiosity shifted into concern as they uncovered more plastic. It became evident that this was a deliberate burial. A chill ran down Zeller's spine as they worked quickly, uncovering more layers of tarp, revealing a large object wrapped inside. With bated breath, the team carefully cut through the plastic. The moment the tarp was unsealed, the stench of decomposition overwhelmed them. What they uncovered was not an animal, but the decomposed remains of a human body. The discovery of Kalen's remains sent ripples of disbelief through everyone involved in the investigation. For 4 years, authorities had searched tirelessly for any sign of the missing Van Craftoft-Quaid family. Now, one of them had been found, but questions about the fate of Serena and Isla only deepened. How had Kalen ended up here? Why was his body concealed in the depths of the Redwoods, wrapped in a tarp? And where were the other two? Forensic analysis of Kalen's body revealed that the cause of death was not immediately apparent. Despite the advanced decomposition, there were no visible signs of trauma on Kalen's remains. There were no broken bones, no gunshot wounds, and no bruises. The mystery surrounding his death only intensified. The state of his body indicated that he had been buried intentionally. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that his remains would not be discovered. Odelia Hastings, Kalen's mother, was devastated by the discovery. She had hoped for years that her daughter and son-in-law would return, that one day they would walk through her door. Now, her worst fears were confirmed, but they were far from over. Kalen's remains were found, but there were still no answers about the whereabouts of Serena or Isla. Had they been buried in another part of the forest? Or had something far worse happened to them? Investigators returned to the grave site, combing the area for any further clues. The ground around the burial site was carefully examined, but there was nothing. No sign of Serena, no sign of Isla, no indication that anyone else had been buried there. The search for answers seemed to lead in circles, with every step raising more questions than it answered. The investigation took a turn when detectives began to look into Kalen's background, as well as his connection to the area. Kalen was an environmental consultant with a deep knowledge of the Redwoods, and he had worked on various conservation projects in the past. He was known for his meticulous attention to detail, especially when it came to wilderness safety. His family's hike had been casual, with no indication that they had planned for anything dangerous. But something didn't add up. Why would Kalen, an experienced hiker, venture so far off the beaten path? And why had he been buried in such a remote area? Investigators began to consider the possibility that the family had encountered something, or someone, that led to their disappearance. Weeks passed, and the case began to stall. That was until a breakthrough came when a search team discovered an unusual clue in the woods near the grave site. A piece of black plastic, identical to the tarp that had been found with Kaylin's body, was discovered nearby, partially buried in the ground. This was significant. It suggested that someone had attempted to conceal evidence of their actions. The discovery led authorities to suspect that there may be more to the story. Someone had deliberately hidden evidence, perhaps to cover up their involvement in the family's disappearance. And then, something even more chilling came to light: the discovery of a strange substance on the tarp. Forensic experts analyzed the plastic and discovered traces of a highly unusual substance: rattlesnake venom. This revelation stunned the investigators. Rattlesnakes were not common in this part of the forest, but the venom found on the tarp matched that of a rattlesnake bite. It was clear that Kaylin had been bitten by a rattlesnake, but the question remained: had he died from the bite, or had something else happened that led to his death? The investigation into Kaylin's death now focused on the theory that he had been bitten by a rattlesnake while hiking. However, the absence of clear signs of struggle, along with the careful burial of his body, suggested foul play. If Kaylin had died from the snake bite, why had his body been hidden? And what about Serena and Isla? Detectives began to examine Kaylin's relationship with the area and his knowledge of the forest. Had he stumbled upon something he shouldn't have? Was there a hidden threat lurking in the woods? As the search for Serena and Isla continued, the investigators began to piece together a new theory: that the family may have encountered someone dangerous in the woods. A breakthrough finally came when a witness came forward. A tourist who had been hiking in the area recalled seeing Kaylin, Serena, and Isla on the day they disappeared. He remembered seeing the family on the trail, smiling and chatting with him. The witness also remembered that the family had seemed normal, with no signs of distress. The last time he had seen them, they were heading deeper into the forest. The investigators now had a solid lead. The family had encountered something, or someone, after the last sighting on the trail. The case was no longer just about a missing family. It was about the dark forces hidden in the heart of the Redwoods, waiting to be uncovered. As the investigation unfolded, the forest began to reveal its secrets. The next step in the investigation would lead to a deeper understanding of what had truly happened to Kaylin, Serena, and Isla. But with each new clue, the story grew more complex, and the true horror behind their disappearance became more apparent. The investigation had stretched for years, becoming a ghost story whispered in the corners of small towns, a mystery that no one could solve. But now, with each passing day, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. As the search for Serena, Kaylin, and Isla continued, the truth began to surface, hiding in plain sight. The deep redwood forests that had swallowed them whole had also kept their secrets. Evidence had been buried beneath the weight of time and thick foliage, but now it was all about to be revealed. The family's tragic end was a story of manipulation, despair, and the darkest corners of human nature. The forensic team had been working tirelessly, and after days of testing, they finally found something. A clue that would unravel the truth of their deaths. The toxicology results, which had been pending for so long, came in. The findings were shocking. Rattlesnake venom. Kaylin had died from a bite, but it wasn't just a random accident. Something darker lurked in the details of his demise. But as the case grew closer to resolution, there was still no sign of Isla. The small baby girl, who had vanished without a trace, left a hole in the investigation. Theories swirled, but the truth was slipping through their fingers. Then came the breakthrough: an old, overgrown logging road on the outskirts of the park. The area had been searched, but the attention had never been fully focused on it. As investigators combed through the thick brush, something caught their eye. It was the remains of a broken tree branch, freshly snapped. The path led them to a secluded cabin, far removed from the main trails and forgotten by time. The structure, built from aged timber, had an air of abandonment, but it was still standing. Something about it felt wrong, like it was hiding more than just the ravages of time. As they approached, the ground beneath their feet crunched with every step. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying wood. They could feel the tension in the air, as though something was watching them from the shadows. Inside, they found the remnants of a life left behind. A tattered bed, a worn-out chair, and piles of forgotten belongings. But one thing stood out. In the corner of the room, hidden beneath a pile of old burlap sacks, was a large, sealed container. The investigators carefully pried open the container. Their hearts raced as they uncovered a bundle of items, including a small, handcrafted blanket, the same blanket that had been seen in the last photos of Isla. There were baby clothes too, neatly folded, but there was something unsettling about them. They had been meticulously preserved, as though waiting for someone to come back. The deeper they dug into the mystery, the more unsettling the truths became. The family's disappearance wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a carefully orchestrated plan. But who could have done this and why? The investigation took a darker turn when the authorities uncovered an old, hidden compartment in the floor of the cabin. Underneath the wooden planks, they found what they were looking for: a series of buried clues pointing to a much larger operation. It became clear now that the family's deaths weren't random. They had been caught in something far bigger than they had imagined. But even as the case neared its end, there was one question that still loomed large. Where was Isla? What had happened to the baby girl? Had she been taken, hidden away somewhere, or worse, had she met the same tragic fate as her parents? With no new leads, the case seemed to be at a standstill. Yet, just as the last hopes began to fade, a call came through that would change everything. An anonymous tip had come in, offering a lead so chilling it sent shivers down the spine of every investigator involved. The caller claimed to know the location of Isla, and they were willing to reveal the truth for the right price. Want to find out what happened to Isla? Keep watching for the next chapter to uncover the shocking truth. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you never miss the next twist in this chilling true crime story.